Hi everyone, Danny here from the Joshua Tree. This week we're thinking about freedom. Freedom is something that's close to all of our hearts. It's something that many of us value, and it's got a range of expressions. From the freedom for our individual beliefs, to the freedom to choose our career, to play our part in the family, to choose friends, independence, freedom, freedom for our political beliefs, our financial decisions, but increasingly there's more freedoms being pushed for our gender, for our sexual orientation, for our autonomy in particular decisions. But I think all of us would say that freedoms aren't absolute. There are always constraints, always things that we are willing to give up our freedom for the greater good, or to enable more important freedoms in our life. And so a society where everyone was able to do whatever they wanted is anarchy. It would be a scary place to live in, and it would actually restrict our ability to enjoy a lot of the freedoms that we currently experience. So freedom is, I guess, really the ability for us to express our mind, to really explore ideas, to learn and to understand and express ourselves in this world. And so one of the great pictures I think of freedom is toddlers, where they tell you what is on their mind when they're in the safety of their family network with parents who they trust in an environment that is pretty safe and secure. They feel like they've got the freedom to be themselves and to start to understand and explore their surroundings. But even within that, there are obligations. They're not free to do everything that they desire. And for them, it's about learning what's right and wrong, what's good and what's not good, and for what it is to play their part within the family. And just like these toddlers are a great expression of freedom, it also shows that freedom comes at a cost. For anyone who understands the life of a parent or has been a parent themselves, there's been much sacrifice for them to provide these conditions where young children can freely express themselves. And so this idea of freedom coming at a cost is something that we see across all aspects of life. Somebody has to sacrifice something to provide the conditions for others to freely express themselves. And so we see this pattern of sacrifice to provide conditions for freedom to come at a cost. It affects all aspects of life. If you're wanting to train for an event, you sacrifice the sweeter, perhaps more unhealthy things in life. If you're wanting to provide a good in an organisation that can't pay you in return, then perhaps you sacrifice a level of financial remuneration that you could have received if you worked in a more profit-orientated sector. And generally we're okay to count the costs for a greater freedom. We're happy to make that choice. But that in and of itself is to elevate the free choice. Perhaps one of the aversions that we have is when there's a sense of obligation placed on us, or when there's an outright claim made by someone that seems to impinge on our freedom. And so I think for all of us, we are cautious about losing freedoms that we have. Often when we think about some of the more difficult stages in life, perhaps caring for elderly family members, this sense of the cost of an act becomes overwhelming. We often admire those who give themselves to these particularly noble tasks, and often we'll say, oh wow, the way that you cared for that person all the way to the end of their life, I really admire that. I couldn't have done that. But perhaps really what's happening deep down in our heart is that we wouldn't want to do that the cost is too high. And so freedom always comes at a cost. And we are generally cautious about losing freedoms that we value. But there's a trajectory with this kind of decision making. The more cautious we are about losing our freedom, the less likely we are to pay the cost. Then the more independent we come, and we actually lose connection with others. But friends, as we think about Christian freedom, I want to say that the picture that God presents is that freedom is found not in disconnection. Freedom isn't about being independent, but freedom is ultimately found in right connections. Connected with those you trust and connected with what is good. Now I think we can see this, can't we? Think about those relationships in our life where we're most free in our thoughts, where we feel most safe to express who we really are and what we really believe. Well, it's sort of like that toddler environment, but as we grow up, it's with friends. It's with our good friends. It's with friends that we can just be ourselves around. Perhaps it's in a marriage, with a trusted relationship, with someone who is committed to be with you for your whole life. There's a sense that we can freely be ourselves. And so connection is important for us to be able to be vulnerable, to trust others. But I also think we see that in the Christian idea of freedom, that freedom isn't actually the end goal. Freedom is actually a means to an end. Ultimately, our freedom is to help us to know God and to do good. And freedom is found as we connect to Jesus. What we're going to see today is that Christian freedom comes from a connectedness with God. We're going to continue where we've been the last couple of weeks in a book of the Bible called 1 Peter. It's a letter that Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends and disciples and followers, wrote to a range of Christians who were scattered in different countries in the first century. They were under particular attack and resistance for their faith, and he's reminding them of who they are and to how they are to live. And so we've seen in chapters 1 and 2 that by trusting Jesus, by becoming connected to God, a new identity exists. That you become a stranger to this world because you have a new hope of an eternal inheritance. And having been recipients of God's gift of himself, there's now a new way of navigating life. And we start to see that in where we've seen before in chapter 2, verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which will wage against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Having been connected by God, having been redeemed by him, bought back, there is now a new purpose. God's purpose for his people is to live good lives. It's this idea of living beautiful lives, attractive lives, lives that align with God's values, lives that are visibly different because they mirror the one who we're now connected to, the holy God. And as we start to see the goodness of this life lived out, there's tangible evidence that God is working in his people, that a relationship exists, and that he is active and present. And so the expression of this good life can be seen from verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. What we see here is the instruction to submit to the authorities that God has allowed to reign over you. Now, this directive is not because the particular authorities deserve it. It's not because you agree with their policies or way of doing things. And it's not because they're going to enforce it and you're going to get in trouble if you don't comply. To be a follower of Jesus is to submit to human authorities for the Lord's sake. There's a sense that we show our connectedness to God by serving and honouring the Lord as we submit to authorities that are over us. And whilst it's right for us to think about our particular authorities in our present day, let's just think about the context that Peter was writing to. The Roman Empire was governed at that time by the neurotic Nero. He was sent and was making radical decisions, had strong opposition, was bringing about physical persecution to those who followed Jesus. He was one of the most unstable leaders the world has ever known. And so it's in that context that this instruction was given. So whilst we want to try and look for disclaimers about maybe where our current situation is a little bit different, the original context sort of sets the bar very high, and I don't think many or any exceptions would present. Now, there is a wider New Testament teaching on how Christians are to interact with the government. There was a situation when Jesus was questioned as to whether we should pay taxes, and he said that there is a place for government rule, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. But what we see here is that the life of surrender to God, to show our connectedness to Him, is to manifest in the way that we relate to all aspects of our society, including those above us. It's not about us trying to assert authority over others, claiming some kind of divine right to reject what they have to say, but rather it is to pursue good and submit to them. Well, why is that? Well, authorities are given by God, we read in Romans chapter 13, and their task is primarily to preserve order within society, to administer justice, and to enable care and support for those on the margins of society. And so Christians are called to live as model citizens, although we are reminded that we are just strangers here. Peter talks about our citizenship being in heaven. But we are to submit to authorities so that they can execute their role, which when done well, is for the good of the multitude. And so the principles I think that the Old Testament picks up that think about how we relate to authorities is to obey them except when they command us to do something that is sinful. And so the fact that God has established this pattern of authority for the orderly function of human life, it both pleases and honors Him when we surrender ourselves to their rule. Now you might think, what has this got to do with freedom? Well, we're about to see that the passage flows into what it means to live in the freedom that God's given. But I wanted to sort of touch on this because it shows that there's a strong relationship. To live as a free person is to surrender to God. And to surrender to God is to surrender in many ways in a whole range of other relationships. Verse 15, for it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Now the end goal that is often been repeated through 1 Peter is the idea of doing good. So life isn't about doing what feels right for you. It's not about what makes us feel good. True freedom is the means, not the end. The goal of our life isn't to be truly free. The goal of our life in Christ is to do good. And so the means to doing good is, verse 16, live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Now this is showing that freedom and submission are not contradictory. Live as free people, live as God's slaves. True freedom comes when we are enslaving ourselves not to self, not to others, but to God. A Christian freedom is in fact the freedom from sin, freedom from the law, freedom from the world's expectations. But it's not a freedom towards independence, but it's a freedom towards the service of God. And so true freedom is consistent with obedience to the will of God. It's about the freedom to do what is right. It's about understanding that we've changed who our allegiance is towards. We no longer live for self. We no longer live for others. We live for God. There's been a change of master. And God's slaves are to do good. So as we think about what this means as citizens in this world, we can't use our Christian freedom to just do whatever we want. We can't use it to excuse doing wrong things. We can't use it to disobey laws. Christian freedom only exists when we are fully surrendering ourselves to God. Freedom is not found in self, but in Him. And so the Christian freedom is these two aspects. Live as free people, live as God's slaves. And what does that look like? Well, verse 17 gives 4 aspects. Show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. Here is a picture of the end result of freedom. This is some of the good that comes from being connected to God and trusting Him. Firstly, respecting everyone, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of their backgrounds. And what does that do when we treat others with respect? Well, it builds connectedness, doesn't it? It actually provides the conditions where people start to trust you, where they can be free with their thoughts and their thinkings, their questions, and their ideas in connection with you. Secondly, it's about love for this new family that you're connected to. Now, love is an all-encompassing category. There's a whole range of ways that we can express love for each other. But what is seen here is that it is good to express our freedom in love for the family of God. Thirdly, it's about our orientation towards God, and it's to have a right fear of Him. In our freedom, we don't live unaccountable, but we live knowing that the one who sees everything will call us to account, and that we live before the God Almighty. And the fourth aspect that flows out of living this free life when we are connected to God is honoring the emperor. Again here, it's not about agreeing with everything that the policies outline. It's not even believing that everything that politicians say is true, but it's about honouring the position and what it provides. So in Australia, honouring would mean thoughtfully voting. It would be trusting in election results. It would be seeking to understand government's decisions and policies. Now, it wouldn't mean just blindly accepting every directive. And it wouldn't be using government policy as God's guideline as to what is morally right. It's not that because something has been enacted in law that it's now right. But honouring government is living in the freedom that Jesus has established. It is an expression of living as a slave of God in this world. And now Peter goes on to show those who in that day couldn't actually live as free people like we do today, but were actually enslaved, actually owned by another, that they too were to submit to their masters, even in the scope of that relationship. And they are instructed to do that, knowing that the way that they respond in their circumstance is commendable to God. And why is that? Well, if we flick down to verse 21, to this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. You see, friends, true freedom, Christian freedom, came at the ultimate cost. The cost of Jesus' own life. That is the gift that we need to continue to remember and highly value. Our freedom from sin has come at an ultimate cost. It is the great gift that is given to us. And it's because of this gift that we are connected to God and we have this new relationship with Him where we can truly be ourselves. We can be free with Him with our thoughts, free with Him with our concerns, our questions, free with Him to change and conform our outlook and to enable us to live these good lives that brings honor and glory to Him. The freedom that God offers isn't an escape from this world. It's not the ability for us to live enslaved to ourselves, but it's an invitation to be able to freely be who we are within His people, in relationship with Him, in partnership with what He is doing in us and through us. And so when we are free from sin, we are enabled to do good. So what does it look like for you to show proper respect to everyone? To love the family of believers, to fear God, and to honor the emperor. These are the ends that can be obtained when we trust in the means of freedom in Jesus.